Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, May 12th. 2022, time for another show. Not that I'm ready for it. Okay, let's see, make sure we get this all hooked up and got all the alarms set to go. Many things happening this morning. Oh, I'm in a panic because all of my cryptocurrency holdings have collapsed. But I don't have any, so I guess it's okay. For those of you who do, well, I'm sorry. But I'm sure that the people listening to this show, if you are holding any money at all in cryptocurrency, were very prudent in their investments. I hope so, because it's bad news for those who haven't, including, I guess, Madison Cawthorn, who I recall this morning I recalled his old tweet, and it's not that old. It's only about 8 to 9 months old, I guess. Just trying to count in my head at the same time. But if I could do that, I'd be rich with cryptocurrency. Anyway, his tweet from September of last year asking, I guess in all earnest, why we were not using cryptocurrency as the new gold standard. Which, I mean, I think was pretty ridiculous on its face when he tweeted it. But now it's just that much worse. Okay, so I don't know what precipitated this whole thing. And I don't know if I'm even going to try to find out. It doesn't matter a great deal to me. It might be an interesting story at some point when we figure out what's going on. But I don't know. All of a sudden, like the other day, I saw everybody was complaining about their ape NFTs again. And it's somebody who paid like $350,000 for it. I don't know. Must have sold it off and it only got like $100 and something for it. That sounds pretty funny. And then the next day, cryptocurrencies collapsed. I don't know if Bitcoin is doing as badly as the rest of them. That's supposed to be like the gold standard of the things that you shouldn't make the gold standard, I guess. But everybody else appears to have collapsed. I don't know. This is going to devastate my son, who I think once accidentally had somebody Venmo him some money and he couldn't return it because he didn't know who sent it and couldn't get in contact with the person. It was like $10 and it sat there for a year, so he didn't bought one of the cryptocurrencies with it, and it turned into $100, but I guess it's back down to 10 cents or something like that. So no harm done. That's the way to invest in. All you need to do to become a crypto millionaire is have people accidentally give you enough money that you could turn into millions of dollars, and then remember to sell it and capitalize on it soon enough. All right. Well, that's happening. Other things are happening. People are pointing out new and interesting stories for us to share. The war in Ukraine continues. The Russians continue to make technological mistakes in the war in Ukraine. This morning, I guess in this modern warfare type stories put in the folder. The story, I guess, of somebody displaying all the phones with SIM cards that are Russian wandering around in Ukraine, and pointing out, hey, this is a pretty good map of the concentration of Russian forces, I think. Although other people were giving the Russians too much credit, saying, a truck full of phones would look the same way. What a great decoy that would be. And I agree, it would be a great decoy. It just didn't seem to be in the Russian playbook. So, more modern technology for targeting your mobile artillery, I guess. This never ends. All right, well, the Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now. Bill tells us from Portland, Maine. We'll turn to Greg in just a moment. Once we find out what Bill has by way of instructions for us, Greg. Sorry, folks, the Senate was unable to invoke cloture, so Kagro X isn't permitted to initiate discussion this morning. Oh, whoops, I should have read that earlier. Instead, please enjoy a 2-hour loop of Robert De Niro mumbling enthusiasms. We do have that, of course, available for everyone. And Greg, the source of all our enthusiasm, is here. Good morning. Let's begin getting enthusiastic then.
Yeah, good morning. Why don't we just invoke closure on Armando? It's always a good standby. Right.
Well, we've done that, and he, I guess he took it seriously. And he hasn't been back in a while. We'll have to invite him in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay. The other thing about the crypto thing,
yes.
And basically the reason crypto's falling is because everything is falling. And it's not immune to what the Fed is doing in terms of raising rates, and it's not immune to the stock market. And it isn't, an isolated thing that somehow can be walled off from everything else.
Oh.
But it's not just crypto. It's also Tesla that's falling. And that, of course, affects Elon Musk, and that affects his ability to buy Twitter. So,
I guess that's
'tis an ill wind
thing.
that blows nobody any good. And the other thing that was interesting about listening to your son's story about going from $10 to 100 to 10 cents is it just reminds us that the way to obtain wealth in this country is to be given it.
Yes, exactly. All you have to do is either that or
I started
ask your
from
parents for a
nothing
small
except
loan.
the $3 million trust fund my father gave me, and I turned it into a $2.7 million enterprise.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way it goes. And if you can, limit it to small amounts of money, like $10, and we'll all be fine.
Right. So in terms of Ukraine, boy, there's some interesting stuff going on. And it isn't just, modern applications of the Ukrainians being very clever about how they do things. We've talked about the show off and on, but I got a drill down into a specific incident, which is just fascinating. But before we get there, Dan Lamont, reporter,
I don't know.
betting on reporters, says U.S.-led sanctions are forcing Russia to use computer chips in dishwashers and refrigerators and some military equipment.
Oh.
So the Russian ordinance is just as deadly, but now it's cleaner and colder, just so you know.
I guess so. And what happened to all the refrigerators and dishwashers? I wonder. Well, they got
they can't be sold to Russian consumers. So Russian consumers are now figuring out, hey, the war does have some effects.
Yeah, right. Maybe that's it. There's a shortage of all of these things. You could lob the chipless dishwashers at Ukrainians if you have the right equipment. All right.
So economist YouGov poll out shows that people supporting sending money to Ukraine, 62 to 17.
Oh, federal money, not theirs.
Our money.
Okay. Yeah.
And the point there is,
I mean, it is
as
theirs,
Justin Tian, who tweeted it, says, to the extent that MAGA Republicans are opposed or don't, or America first and don't want to do this, it's going to be one of their single least popular issues.
Cool. Yeah, that was that comes up a lot. And I think it was a big Twitter fight yesterday between Eye Patch Guy and Empty Green. Yesterday, fighting over, I guess she voted against sending the money, and they fought on Twitter about it. So, super exciting. Dan Crenshaw. Eye Patch Guy. You know who I mean.
Yeah.
That's the guy.
Dan
right.
One Eye versus Margie Three Name.
Yeah, right. So, keep an eye on Dan Crenshaw, because he needs you to, because he's got just the one.
Well, he's a more traditional conservative, but, we'll get to that in the politics section about the fascinating stuff that bubbles up from the base. But going back to Ukraine right now.
He voted aye on the. All right, just kidding. I'm sorry. I only do it because he made Pete Davidson apologize for it, and I don't know. Somehow I'm not going to do it, and that's going to work out great for me.
That's fine. Crenshaw, is marginally more acceptable than MTG, and so that's the way it is. So the Institute for the Study of War says, as their overall report of what happened yesterday, Russian forces didn't make any significant advances anywhere in Ukraine. Oh. Pretty good, huh? Nice day for Russia. And the Ukrainian forces took further ground northeast of Kharkiv, which we've been talking about. They had a counteroffensive there, limited in the sense of, just that area, but they're basically making it all the way to the Russian border.
Okay.
Right?
Yes, right.
Ukrainian counteroffensive north of Kharkiv city has forced Russian troops onto the defensive and necessitated reinforcement and replenishment efforts intended to prevent further Ukrainian advances toward the Russian border. That means they have to take all the stuff they have in the south and move it up to Kharkiv, which is north, so they can't use all of their assets to continue on to Odessa or Berlin or wherever the heck they think they're going to do in their fevered minds. And so that's not working out for them. Russian efforts along the southern axis, Donetsk and Luhansk, remain similarly stalled, and Russian forces have not made any significant gains in the face of continued successful Ukrainian defenses. So they're not going anywhere. And now they have to throw, refrigerators and dishwashers at them. Right. Talk about throwing the kitchen sink. That's next.
Oh, yes. All right. New
right? And
appliance.
it's not going that well. But the Ukrainians are, in fact,
hardware
going the other way.
All right. Well, good for them.
Key takeaways. Pro-Russian telegram sources reported Ukrainian forces may be conducting a counterattack 40 kilometers north of Izium to cut off Russian units, though we can't confirm that. We've been talking about that because it isn't just a question of getting assets back in Kharkiv. And I'm going to send you a map here because this map is the one I was looking for the other day and couldn't find. Shows Kharkiv up in the northeast sector, but you could see the little body of water that's between them and Russia.
Yes.
And so there's water to be crossed, rivers and other things. And that's where this next tweet thread, which is just fascinating. And this is I've been cleared to tell you this, so I'm going to tell you this story by a Ukrainian military engineer.
Okay.
And it goes, what I did to destroy the Russian pontoon bridge over Siversky, a thread.
Siversky.
Here you go.
This is like an essay he writes.
Yeah.
What I did.
So
what I did
the
this summer.
I'm a UA, that is Ukrainian Army, military engineering officer. And I've served one term in Donbass prior to the recent invasion. Recently, I've accomplished a mission which made huge impact on Russian losses and completely screwed up their plans to encircle Lysychansk.
Okay, and probably our efforts to pronounce it as well.
Do my best. Initially, there was intelligence from frontline units that there were Russians on the other side of the river, and they're gathering various vehicles. So my commander asked on the 6th of May, me, as one of the best military engineers to do engineering reconnaissance.
Wow.
Together with recon units for backup, I go to explore the area on 7th May.
Okay.
Right? Frontline units in the area report multiple Russian vehicles gathering on the other side of the river. So I explore the area, and I suggest a location where Russians might attempt to mount a pontoon bridge to get to the other side. And I used rangefinders to figure out the river's 80 meters wide. So the Russians would need 8 parts, 10 meters each, of the bridge connected to get to the other side because the pontoon bridge is built with parts.
Yeah, 8.
Right? So, it's 80 meters, so you need 8 parts, 10 meters each.
Bring an extra part. I would.
With that flow of the river, I knew they would need motorized boats to arrange such a bridge, and it would take them at least 2 hours. Took me a day to check everything, and I had to do it on the 8th of May as well, so I reported the information I had to my commanders. Also, I told the unit that observed that part of the river they need to be on the lookout for the sound of motorboats.
Okay.
Now, visibility was shit in the area because the Russians then put fields and forests on fire, and they were throwing a lot of smoke grenades.
That's a good idea.
And on top of that, it was foggy. And our guys had to hear the sound. So on the 8th of May, right at the place I said, I'm there to check it as well, okay? And then I see them starting to build the bridge, and I think my recon and hints of the river made the biggest impact. I outplayed the Russian military engineers. Russians attempted to place a bridge right in the place where I guessed. The river unit didn't see them, but they heard the motorboats.
Aha. So, okay.
So the artillery was ready. It was all lined up. It was all aimed, etc. And we've been able to confirm Russians mounted 7 parts of the bridge out of 8. Russians have even succeeded to move some troops and vehicles over the river. Combat starts in 20 minutes. Heavy artillery engaged against Russian forces. Aviation chipped in as well. I was still in the area, and I've never seen and heard such heavy combat in my life. After one day, the bridge is down. Russian forces, about 30 to 50 vehicles plus infantry, are struck on the Ukrainian side of the river. No way back. They tried to run away using the broken bridge. Then they tried to arrange a new bridge, and aviation started heavy bombing of the area, and it destroyed the remains of all the Russians and all the other bridges. And rumors say it's about 1,500 Russians dead. Their strategic objective was to cross the river and then encircle Lysychansk, which I can't pronounce, and they miserably failed.
Wow.
So by the 10th of May, the pontoon bridge completely down. That's about time when you start to get all the picture of the area, and I'm on the ground doing the work there. And I did my part, and I'm proud to serve.
Well, all right.
And so, it's an interesting, this is what it's like on the ground going on here, and here's the kind of things we're doing. we know we're not going to be able to see. So we figure out what's going on, and then we tell our fellow soldiers here, listen for the sound of the motorboats. If they try to block it out with fires and smoke, we don't know they're going to do that. If it's going to be foggy the next day, we don't know they're going to do that. It doesn't matter. If you can't see, listen for the sound of the motorboats. Yeah. They did. It worked. And then he's got pictures of the destroyed bridge. It's a real story, and it's just fascinating.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's a good one. Well done there. Maxime, it looks like his name is, if I'm reading the Cyrillic right. So good job, Max, probably for short. And interesting tactic, too. I don't know whether it was his plan to let some of the Russians across and then trap them, or whether he wanted to blow up the bridge before any of them got across. But it works out. And good thinking, excellent redundancy built into it. And I don't know whether he guessed that they might try to obscure the line of sight. I mean, I guess I would, now that you mention it. Like,
luck is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. So he does the work, sets it up, and then they're in a position to take advantage of it. And, oh, how lucky they happened to stumble across those motorboats. Well, more than that.
Yeah. It's a good, it's great advanced work, right, to recognize that. A lot of people might know that and maybe would put it in a report possibly, but then it depends on people reading the report. Well done. All right. Great. And too bad for the people who crossed the bridge early and got stuck. I guess they're captured or dead now.
Yeah, a lot of them dead, I think.
Yeah.
So
now we have their SIM cards.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's war. Can't cheer for it too loud, but well done if you're rooting for Ukraine. And if you're not, get out of here.
And again, the fascinating thing here, as we talked about yesterday, stepping back a little bit, is the balance that Zelensky's going to have with pushing the Russians back, but not pushing the Russians too far. And he's going to have to figure that out. And the U.S. and Europe is going to have to let him take the lead on that. It's interesting because the U.S. is all in on backing Ukraine, and the Europeans, of course, are having cold feet because they're the Europeans. The Germans are stepping it up, while Hungary is stepping it down, afraid of losing Russian oil. Ukraine has actually cut off one of the pipelines. Russian oil will have to be, or Russian gas, I should say, will have to be rerouted.
You'd think they would.
And the French are the ones that are most concerned about going too far. They want to be the peacemaker and try to push negotiations.
Well, that's nice.
And what the Brits are doing is unclear. They're still trying to figure out what to do about Ireland. And Northern Ireland because Sweden. Of Brexit and also because of the latest Northern Ireland vote, which is Sinn Féin.
Yes.
Which is kind of interesting.
Féin,
and, Olivier Knox writes, Russia will take years to recover from the early Ukraine setbacks.
All right. Take all the time you need.
Okay. He may be more dangerous now than before because he's losing. Boom. So he may be tempted to try drastic new steps. That's what everybody's worried about.
Yeah.
And he's refocused the war aims. He's made them smaller, maybe, but he's not going away. And Russia won't be satisfied, he writes, with merely conquering Donbass, even assuming they can, says the Director of National Intelligence, ours. Putin aims to occupy southeastern Ukraine, connecting to Crimea, build a land bridge to Transnistria, and that's basically his plan. But the conventional military will need years to recover because they wiped out so much equipment.
All the tires are gone.
Right. It's going to take them years, said Avril Haines, who's the DNI director. And interestingly, that makes it sound, Olivier Knox writes, like Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's controversial late April expression of hope Russia will be so weakened it can't invade other neighbors. And that may be coming true. And a top French military official recently said something similar, despite whatever Macron said.
Oh. Well.
Now Putin bets that democracies will weaken before Russia. So he wants to see Hungary fight with France, fight with England, fight with the U.S. and such. And it's not happening at the moment. Biden's holding everything together. And I really, I don't care what you think of him. But thank goodness Biden is president right now.
Yes.
Because he's doing a pretty good job in balancing the foreign policy side of things.
Yeah, I mean, this is not something you could have left in Trump's hands. Trump would have been still is pro-Russian. You don't have to guess. He's still pro-Russian. And what might that have meant
Well, he's behind the scenes
for
quietly
anything.
getting it done. He's
Yeah.
not out there doing the flashy stuff in front of them. I said that I am
That's
going
true,
to take
too.
down North Korea. No.
Even without that, even if he were a braggart, he would be doing the right thing. And, here's a good question I hadn't considered. What's the possibility? I mean, no one's ever thought of doing anything like this, but if Trump were still in office and the Russians were still, for whatever reason, doing poorly in Ukraine, would Trump offer the Russians military assistance? Or would he just say, well, they lost. I mean, no skin off mine. I mean, that would be incredible. But I don't know. He's done dumber and weirder things. I don't know if the Russians would accept American assistance, even if we offered it. But I guess it's possible that he's just that dumb that he would offer. I mean,
since they're building their
nuking
war
hurricanes.
machine based on refrigerators and dishwashers,
yeah,
we would
Well, maybe
offer
we could.
America's latest
Maybe that's it. Right. We'll
in
substitute
return
our
for Trump Tower in
dishwashers.
Moscow.
Right.
It's a fair trade. It's
I
just a
think
business
so.
deal.
Yeah. What's the difference, right? And if
Anyway,
he didn't like
Olivia
sending
Knox
weapons, he
writes,
could send
the war is a
those.
stalemate until it isn't.
Okay.
Asked about the state of the fighting. I would characterize it as the Russians aren't winning and the Ukrainians aren't winning, and we're a bit of a stalemate here. If Russia doesn't declare war and mobilize, the stalemate is going to last for a while. And even though they may not be as well trained and competent when they get conscripts, they will still bring mass and a lot more ammunition. So the war is a stalemate until it isn't. Again, our newspapers,
Yes.
particularly Washington Post, New York Times, are very Russo-centric and tend to write everything in terms of and the military analysts, especially from overseas, from Australia and the UK, have pointed this out in terms of, well, Russia is going to win. Well, they're going to win right away. Well, if they don't win right away, they're still going to win eventually. And they don't credit Ukraine with agency of its own. We talked about this on the show. It's the Mike Tyson plan. Everybody's a plan until you get punched in the face. Well, Ukraine punched Russia in the face, and their plans just sort of blew up, along with their tanks.
Yeah.
And so maybe Russia isn't going to win, and maybe isn't going to go the way things say right here. So, it's important to keep that in mind as you analyze this. This one is from The Economist, again from overseas. How rotten is Russia's army? Vladimir Putin uses warfare to make up for Russia's weaknesses. That's why he's so dangerous. And then, of course, it has the famous picture of the tank turret with this looks like a skull, or a brooch.
There's
That we're now all familiar with.
horseshoe crab.
And the picture is credited to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. I love that. So you can use it all you want to.
Well, okay, freebie for us. Yeah, I can see, as you were saying it and reminding us of how Russo-centric the major papers are. I mean, I guess my guess at explaining it would be, just decades of being told and believing that the main threat to everything, at least in Europe, in terms of European security, was Russia. And that was because they had the massive and efficient army that could win any battle. And it's going to take a long time to shed that. And there's no background on the Ukrainian military or the Ukrainian fighting spirit or anything. We don't know about that. It was always just Soviet, and then it just was this other thing that had never fought a war.
Well, part of it is that, and certainly part of it is being based in Moscow. Other people have pointed out the problem with American and Western, but particularly American reporting, is that it's what does Moscow think? As if there's a whole other part of Russia that's not in Moscow. Are you aware of those areas which are very poor and not necessarily Slavic ethnic, where the conscripts are coming from and being sent to Ukraine? And if you don't know those areas, then do you really understand what the troops and conscripts are thinking? It's like trying to explain France, except only through Paris.
There are no hotels in these oblasts. I can't go and report from there.
Right? Or what about trying to explain Illinois only through the prism of Chicago? Or, let me talk to you about New York, but only from New York City. Upstate New York doesn't really exist.
Well, I guess I would say let's use our best resources, or capitalize on our practices elsewhere. Some of you are explaining the United States only through a diner. Can you help us figure out how to get to the
pretty
hinterlands?
much. So they get stuck in these, ways of doing things that just don't really fit the moment. And I think that's part of the explanation for how come they seem to be so Russocentric. Get out of Moscow and start talking to people outside of Moscow.
Do it like mine.
Well, you can't. It's dangerous. I get that.
Exist.
But then don't think that what you hear is the only side of the story.
Well, that's true. Although you would think that maybe, well, I'm sure if they have a Kyiv bureau, it's young and isn't established in the newsroom in terms of its clout. That's not where you hope to get sent as a foreign
correspondent. Well, the Kyiv bureau is great. I mean, Tim Mack he just got rotated out, by the way, from NPR.
Oh,
he's now,
so we don't know.
He's in Poland, so he said, I'm not going to give you my daily, Kyiv is still in Ukrainian hands because I'm not there anymore.
How's Poland doing? It's in Polish hands.
Well, we'll hear.
He should tell us
he starts
that
way.
Good morning from Bolivia, which is still in Bolivian hands.
Good morning from Warsaw. They still speak Polish.
But yeah, I guess they certainly do have those Kyiv bureaus now, but they don't have the tradition. And I imagine, like with the White House beat, it still was considered like maybe a prestige posting, whereas Kyiv wasn't.
Yes.
So, yeah, all right. Well,
so a lot
in a war,
that'll
change things.
Read, again, our papers of record have done a marvelous job documenting the humanitarian issues. But when it comes to the military part, you really have to search, if you can find it at all, about what the Institute of War is pointing out about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has now been taking place over about 10 days.
Yes.
You hear about it here on the show because I report on it, and I report on it because others are. But you're not hearing it from the Times and the Post.
Well,
I'm not doing direct reporting. I'm giving credit to the people who are telling us about this, and that's usually the military analysts.
Right. And even if they are doing a not-so-great job on it, they are doing original reporting about the war, and we have to rely on them for that. So, all right, so we point out the shortcomings. Okay, let's do it again and point out other shortcomings over the next segment after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We're back. Time to do more of this news thing.
Well, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about SCOTUS and Roe. Before I do that, though, I do want to mention something about the ongoing pandemic that isn't over. And people are still getting sick with it. So, you know, that's a big deal. However,
famous people even.
And people, friends and other people that, are in your own circle. The thing is that if you step back and remember what the original thinking was when the pandemic started, you could argue that what the federal government has done, for good or for ill, and for many ways it's ill because it's too simplistic, but for good or for ill, they said, look, the whole idea here is to flatten the curve so that we can protect our hospitals so they don't become overwhelmed.
Right. That was the most important thing at first.
Right. Be St. Louis, not Philadelphia. Remember all that stuff. So fast forward to now, and you could argue that, look, we know the pandemic isn't over. The feds know the pandemic isn't over. The CDC knows the pandemic is over. So does the president, even if he attended the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Mm-hmm. But the hospitals are not being overwhelmed at the moment. The phase that we're in, given how many people have already had the virus, plus how many people have been vaccinated, is such that even though we're doing a terrible job of boosting the boosters, even though we're doing a terrible job of getting people vaccinated and protecting them, on the other hand, the hospitals are not being overwhelmed. So if you think that is our prime job going back to the beginning of the pandemic, we're doing all right with that.
Curve flattened.
Yeah. So, if that's the approach they're taking, you can scratch your head and say, yeah, well, that still leaves a lot of people getting sick, getting long COVID, having issues for the future. You're not exactly protecting us by doing that. But at least they're doing the prime thing of keeping the hospitals running. I think that's insufficient, so I'm not happy with it. But, when you step back and look at the big picture, that seems to be what's going on. And that may help explain how come they're saying, look, I know it's rough, but we're still having the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and this is the attitude we're taking.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really still need to. You never had to have that dinner in the first place, even without coronavirus.
Well, yeah, it was always stupid, and now it's even more stupid.
Yeah, but that's a good point. I mean, you can at least say, all right, well, if that was the goal, okay, then I guess mission accomplished on that one. I mean, I think
you don't want to say that because George W. Bush, but, mission accomplished on that one.
Say it. But yeah, okay, so well done there, and it's a good thing. We want the hospitals to keep running. And, I mean, I guess we should have entered a new phase at some point and had come up with a new slogan or
the downside of being more restrictive is what it does to the economy. And we're already dealing with pandemic-induced inflation and other things. And so, politically, we're just not going there, particularly when the public just doesn't want to follow.
I guess. I mean, basically, I guess the message could have been, the curve was flattened, and now even if you get it, you probably won't end up in the hospital. You should be careful, but go ahead and go shopping. I mean, that's okay.
The storm is over.
Yes.
But there's still riptide, so, swim at your own risk.
Okay. That's, sure. People are used to that. Bring a raincoat, It's not thunder and lightning, but, if it rains, you'll get wet. What are you going to do about that?
We're telling you now, we don't have enough lifeguards, so be careful.
All right. Well, I don't know. Most people's idea of that is Baywatch, and they never run out of lifeguards, so I don't know if they'd get it. But all right. Yeah, that's a good point. We just didn't really shift into any new mode, even though we defeated the hospital.
I'm from Kansas. I don't know what you're talking about. What's a riptide?
Right. It was a great show, Riptide, way back in the, late 70s, early 80s. They had a pink helicopter. That's about all I remember about this show.
Right. So, Monmouth, let's switch gears here, had a poll out yesterday, national poll. 57% of Americans say SCOTUS should leave the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision alone.
Yes.
Leave Brittany alone.
All right, yeah.
Abortion should be 33% always legal, 31% legal with limitations, 26% illegal with some exceptions, and 8% always illegal. Only 8% say always illegal, and the 8% is who Alito belongs to. Yeah. And that's part of the issue with his incredibly bad draft opinion, which apparently hasn't changed yet because all the new leaks say that, nobody's changed their mind yet. And we don't even know if that's true. But here it is. And I think one of the things this poll does is reinforce what we were talking about again on the show yesterday. You can look at nuance and say, if you slice the thirds, 33% always legal, 31% legal with limitations, 26% illegal with some exceptions, and mix and match them, you can get the opinion that I'm telling you the public thinks, which matches mine. But that's not really what it is, right? You can always say, but for me personally, I think legal with limitations. And so that doesn't mean that 33% always legal are radical. And that's the favorite word of the Republicans. The radical Republicans like to call their opponents radical because that way you won't think they're radical. Yes. So they use the radical thing in every sentence about Democrats because they always stay on message. But the point is, it's really simple. Who decides and should you change it? And who decides? Most people think it's between a woman and her doctor. And should you change things? The public overwhelmingly says no. So you could take all the nuance you want. That's really the bottom line. And so the public supports the idea of not going along with what Alito says, and that's why the Republicans have problems. They know they have problems. We read from Axios the other day about, Republicans worried that they're going to wind up being on the wrong side of the abortion issue politically. And they didn't want this to come up, but it did anyway. And that was a big deal, and that was a problem. And it's still a big deal, and it's still a problem. Interestingly, my senator, who's very good, Chris Murphy, had this piece that Greg Sargent wrote about in the Washington Post. Chris Murphy's urgent abortion warning reveals a hidden GOP threat.
What is that?
Do you believe that once back in power, the Republicans will let a trifling procedural relic like the filibuster stand in the way of decisive, absolute, rapturous triumph? Chris Murphy doesn't.
Question? Oh, all right.
Right? If the court overturns Roe, the Connecticut Democrat says once Republicans take control of Congress and the White House, they'll end the legislative filibuster to pass a national abortion ban with a simple majority in the Senate. When the opportunity presents itself, there's no doubt in my mind they'll change the rules. Now, the thinking behind this is what I think is fascinating. And this is actually from a piece by Jonathan Chait that's in New York Magazine. Will social conservatives make Mitch McConnell kill the filibuster? And step back and say, okay, the piece is too long. I'm not reading it.
All right.
Here's the argument.
Yes.
All right. Mitch McConnell has been very clearly, as somebody said, he's a front stabber, not a backstabber. He always tells you what he's going to do, and then he does it. And he said, I'm not killing the filibuster. I like the filibuster.
Okay.
And Joe Manchin and Sinema say, we like the filibuster too. But if you try to drill down and ask why, the answer seems to be, as Chait explains it, most logically Occam's razor kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The money side of the Republican Party is a little bit more socially liberal than the radicals who make up the vast majority of the Republican-based voters.
Yeah.
Because the vast majority of the Republican-based voters are completely radical. So they're the one-third of the country that's completely on the other side of the two-thirds, Democrats and independents. And they want to do things like make abortion completely illegal. They're the 8%, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing is, they're always pushing the Republicans to do things that the people running for office don't necessarily want to do. They don't want to be Todd Aiken if they don't have to be, right? They don't want to be tagged with the super radical brush if they can avoid it. So the filibuster is Mitch McConnell's way, in other words, of saying to his base, look, I'd love to do it, but I can't. The filibuster.
True.
You came up with this incredibly bad idea that if we actually ran on that, like let's say get rid of the Affordable Care Act and bring back slavery and whatever it is you want to do, I'd love to help you, but I can't because this filibuster won't let me. So that's what drives him to say, I'm not changing the filibuster. If I changed the filibuster, I'd be answerable to the nutcases that make up my base. I don't want that.
All right. It's a theory. Good one.
So that's Jonathan Chait's theory, and actually it makes as much sense as anything else.
Sure.
And given that, it allows McConnell to, not go totally radical. The thing is, if the Senate then becomes like 51-49 Republican in the next election, for the sake of argument, or worse, will he have the fortitude, strength, and ability to stop getting rid of the filibuster if that becomes in the way of making abortion illegal throughout the United States? Mm-hmm. The money people behind McConnell are against some of the things that the base wants to do, but they're not necessarily against everything. And they may not. I mean, if you have to count on corporations to be the thing that makes Mitch McConnell keep the filibuster, good luck to you. Because they're completely amoral and they don't think about that stuff.
Right. Well, that's a theory. It could happen that way, and of course,
but it makes Mitch McConnell's maneuvering on the filibuster much more understandable, and to a certain lesser extent, Sinema and Manchin. Like Manchin is really conservative, but he doesn't necessarily want to be on the line for all of these votes. He hates that. So you got the filibuster; he's off the hook.
Sort of, although it's not. It doesn't seem to be
working for him in West Virginia. Totally local stuff.
Local only, yeah. And that's all that matters vote-wise.
And that's all that matters to them.
Yeah. Well, it could explain an awful lot. I mean, certainly the theory
take a separate issue, Mark Kelly and Title 42.
All right.
And immigration stuff. Mark Kelly, the Democrat, reasonable guy, hates when immigration comes up. He's in Arizona.
Yes.
It's an issue. You'd rather it not be an issue. Right? It's all local.
Sure.
All politics is local, and you can make it national by saying this is a national issue, but
just say it.
depends how it goes locally, and that's where Susan Collins comes in. Maine is not Arizona. Maine is not Kentucky.
Yeah.
Right.
Why are we saying
So
that?
Susan Collins knows that Maine is pro-choice, and so that's why she always does that ridiculous dance of I'm a Republican and I'd like to do everything Republicans want to do, but I have to pretend not to.
Yeah.
Whereas a Manchin is, look, I'm really conservative. I'd like to do everything conservatives do, but I have to do it in a way that protects me. And so I can't go too far one way and I can't go too far the other way. So in that sense, filibusters and avoiding votes, is what I prefer. Chuck Schumer says, well, why don't you write the bill you want for reconciliation and we'll get to it.
Right.
And Manchin said, I'm not doing that. That exposes me. Then my constituents will see what I'm trying to do here, and I don't want that. You write it.
Yeah.
I'll nibble it.
Tell you why it's wrong.
Yeah, but, don't put me in the spotlight. That's the exact opposite of what I want.
Yeah, I mean, it's
So you think about it that way. Their performative behavior in the Senate makes a whole lot more sense.
Yes. Okay. I mean, it does explain quite a lot. It's been, like I said, it's been floated before, the theory that the filibuster obscures the true preferences of the people in the Senate, and they like to use it that way. And it's helpful for winning re-election. Not helpful for doing anything.
Right, and that theory, in fact, is why Chuck Schumer forced a vote yesterday that he knew was going to fail.
Yeah.
Right, and he used to, what do they call it?
Messaging.
A vote to, I don't know what they call the vote to make you go on record.
Oh.
I forget the term for it.
Nothing. But in the House,
show vote
messaging bills, as they sometimes refer to things.
A message vote is what they call it.
That's what we'll say they call it for now.
Yeah,
So.
but it used to be helpful. It's not helpful anymore because the Republicans, because of the Electoral College, say, okay, well, send a message. My constituents want me to vote the way I'm voting.
Right. Well, yes.
It doesn't help you
Pooh.
if you're from Nevada. It doesn't help you if you're from New Hampshire. But in Kentucky, they don't care.
Yeah.
You want to make me go on record as voting against abortion? That's only going to help me back home.
Guess so. So,
does Roy Blunt worry about going on the record? No.
probably not. Maybe he should, but probably not.
Right. So again, all politics is local in that regard.
Okay.
Now, here's an interesting little factoid. This is from the New York Times. Why the Justice Department is unlikely to investigate the Supreme Court leak.
Okay.
Two simple reasons. One, it was a conservative.
All right. We know who did it.
And
Also, who cares?
so the conservatives aren't really going to push for criminalization of conservative leaks. The other is, as the article says, quote, it's far from clear the justices want agents of the executive branch grilling their clerks and relatives and going through the computers in their chambers and the cell phones of their associates, end quote. Can you imagine? Ginny Thomas, give me your cell phone.
Yeah.
I want to find out who leaked this.
She's not even in that
What
branch.
else are you going to find out on there?
Yeah.
Quickly, scrub all my I wanted to overthrow the government stuff.
Well, what they want, of course, is harassment of liberal clerks. But they forgot that, a thorough investigation would look at both. Oh.
Right. And by the way, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not the one to say this, but I see experts on Twitter saying, you know what, it's not even criminal. So
Yeah. Right. It's not clear that they're apparently...
maybe immoral, but it's not criminal. What law do they break?
At this point, yeah. On the other hand, you can make that law, apparently, from the bench. So you could try that if you get the right case. But somebody has to hand it to you.
And my last piece for today is from BuzzFeed, which I just thought was interesting. Julia Reinstein reporting. We spoke to the woman who wrote the chalk message that Susan Collins called the cops over.
Wow, a terrorist, really?
Well, remember how people were protesting Kavanaugh and somebody said, won't the neighbors get upset? And they said, we are the neighbors.
Right.
Well, You know who wrote the chalk message? A neighbor.
Yeah, well, who else is going to travel to Susan Collins's house?
Quote, it was just two women fed up with not being able to talk to the representative, and it's a beautiful day, so we grabbed some chalk and took to the streets. It's a great story.
Yeah, good.
Right? Collins certainly saw the message, and so did countless others across the country.
She called the police. We know she saw it.
So the woman, who we shall call Jane, because that's what the story calls her, it was never meant to be like an undercover darkness type thing. It was just two women fed up with not being able to talk. So Saturday afternoon on a public sidewalk outside Collins's home, the two friends wrote, Susie, please, Mainers want the Women's Health Protection Act, WHPA. Vote yes, clean up your mess. So the chalk message was intended as a last-ditch effort to sway Collins. And when asked why she did it, she said, well, Susan Collins hasn't held a town meeting in 20 years. When we email her, when we call her, the only thing we get is her form letter saying, this is what we're doing this week. And we're sick of being ignored and dismissed, so we did this.
That's a fine thing to do, if you ask me, and I think that's the point of the story.
Yeah.
No
On Saturday,
meetings.
Jane texted her friend, an artist, who agreed to join her. Then, like any good millennial, she said, I went on Target and I ordered a 24 box of bold chalk.
I've seen them at the stores. I can't believe they're selling these terrorist supplies openly.
Right. And then she went by the following day and she saw it had been erased. It wasn't until Monday she read a local news article and learned what happened. Collins had called the cops, after which the Public Works Department washed away the chalk. In a statement to the Bangor Daily News, the senator referred to the chalking as, quote, the defacement of public property, end quote. And Collins did not respond to a request for comment from BuzzFeed's news. The Bangor Police Department determined the message wasn't threatening. No crime was committed. Right? The police report described the chalking as intricately drawn in multiple different colors and specified that Collins was the one that called 911 because it was an emergency.
Yes. Thanks for wasting our resources and not flattening the curve, as it were.
Right. So discovering the elected official had quite literally gotten the message erased, left them feeling frustrated and unheard, but luckily the box of chalk was a 24-pack. So on Tuesday, she and her friend went back and filled the sidewalk with even more messages. This is the part you haven't heard about, about abortion rights. This time they added another, you might not recognize our right to free speech, but I hope you recognize my right to have an abortion.
Okay. Well,
several neighbors came out, spoke to them as they wrote the messages. They were all incredibly supportive and additionally expressed their displeasure at their taxpayer dollars and city resources being used to clean up sidewalks.
Yeah.
Stephen King has a house on the same street, and he even tweeted the new messages. You work for us.
Yeah.
Mainers for abortion
rights.
rights.
To say that anyway.
So then Collins's husband, lobbyist Thomas Daffron, comes out and confronts them, and he calls them idiots. And in the audio recording, which was reviewed by BuzzFeed News, a man identified by Jane as this fellow, her husband, can be heard speaking angrily, accusing the women of defacing my sidewalk. And telling him that the chalkings were not doing any good for their cause and wanted to find out who the lady's employer was, but she didn't tell him.
Who's your employer? Oh, that's low.
And then he claimed they called the police because they previously received death threats, but she said she thinks it was a bit of an overreaction to a peaceful message.
Yes.
Well, we were cordial. We were polite. I'm not sure, like radical militia types typically write in chalk on on sidewalks. And he kept reiterating they've been threatened. Bodies. So then you totally understand how I feel, Jane said to him. The idea that you have a right to your own body is all we want too.
Yeah.
Right. So he went to walk the dog, and when he came back, he was much nicer. He said they should call Collins's office to set up a meeting. And when they said they tried that already, he told them to call again and tell him who we were. We had spoken with him, and he would try to make it happen.
So in other words,
it worked.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. So well done there. And, I did see somebody, I heard that the message had come back, and I saw somebody on Twitter yesterday saying all that she did was guarantee that her sidewalk is going to be chalked forever.
Right.
So
if that didn't work, Susan's husband said to them, come back and knock on the door and I'll make it happen. So hours later, they saw him washing the messages away with a hose. They didn't have to call the police. It was easy enough.
Use your own hose.
It's really a relatively nice story. Maine's a nice place.
Yeah, it is nice. I knew they had to be neighbors because, of course, everybody knows, like I say, who else would travel to Susan Collins's house to chalk that message, given that, you as you know, you can't get there from here. It doesn't matter who you are, but it would have to be neighbors to do that. So I'm glad this story developed, and nothing points it out better than, one, her husband coming out and being angry and getting recorded doing it. That's funny. And then all of a sudden he realizes, I have to change my tune. And then what tune is it? The tune is, you win. I'll make it happen. Why don't you call the office and try to set up a meeting? Well, we tried that. It doesn't work. All right, well, I'll intervene for you. Well, why? Because we're doing this. That's why.
Right. So the last piece here, last part of it, is that if anybody wants advice from these two ladies in terms of how to make their voices heard, she said, chalk under $3 for 24 colors. Super recommend.
Yes. Very good. Reminds me a lot of the old freeway blogger who wasn't directly targeting any houses, but also super cheap communication device, and it gets a lot of attention. So chalk, the highway signs, whatever it is you choose to do, make sure you do it. Don't think it won't work. By the way, if you were wondering, what happens to these neighbors if instead of doing the chalk, they just go straight to knocking on the door to ask for a meeting? Call the cops is the answer to that one. And they're trying to break my door down. So they handle it exactly correctly. Even though I'm sure they didn't plot it out. They told you the story of it. I just wanted to write the message.
Right, you invited me to knock on the door, so
yeah,
this is
now
not a
you
threat.
can. Right. But had they knocked on the door why didn't you just knock on the door and try to set up a meeting? Come on, you called the police when I wrote in chalk. What do you think was going to happen when I knocked on your door? It would have been the Tucker Carlson story all over again.
Right,
They're trying to break in, help me.
Right, and then the other approach, of course, is Chuck Schumer's approach, because somebody asked him, what do you think about all this? He said, what's a big deal? People protest in front of my house like every day.
Yeah. Well,
which they do, by the way.
Yes, right.
Right. It's New York, and people have opinions, and they're not shy about it. And so, suck it up and get used to it.
Yeah. But we're from Maine.
Well, in terms of Kavanaugh.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, good. I'm glad it worked. It's a great story. I love the fact that it all happened that way and that they can speak out and tell other people how they, too, can speak out. There's lots of cheap ways to do it. Doesn't always have to be all that innovative. I mean, they didn't invent anything new there. So give it a shot. Now, some senators, I believe, probably do live in places where they would be able to claim to own the sidewalk. There are such places.
Well, the point is don't be threatening.
Yeah. Right. I mean, or at least
clear,
that's a very
protest.
That
but
seems
don't
to be an effective way of doing things too, to not have to be threatening. And sometimes, so certainly the stories that get reported on with favorable reflection on you.
And the other side of the coin is when people say, well, you shouldn't be threatening justices or anybody else. Fine, but that's only half the story. The real thing you should have said is it's okay to protest, but don't threaten people.
Yes.
You left out the it's okay to protest part.
Right. Yes, you did do that, and it facilitates the Republican message, which is that protest is threatening, and but only when you do it. When we do it, it's awesome and patriotic. And
so
P.S. maybe also
in the 3 minutes we have left, I do want to cover this. This is the Axios story from today.
Why does it matter?
GOP panics over ultra MAGA Pennsylvania Senate wild card.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
okay.
Mastriano.
Influential Republicans in Washington and among the nationwide party elite are having a belated oh crap moment over the previously unimaginable prospect that Kathy Barnett could win the party's nomination.
Oh, okay. I have the wrong person in mind.
Kathy Barnett is a super MAGA person.
Which race are we
soaring
talking
in
about?
the polls ahead. She's just behind Oz.
Okay.
And
Senate,
the other titan of industry who's
okay.
running, whose name I can't even remember.
It doesn't matter. Let's focus on this nut.
McKinley McCormick. I think it's McCormick. Former hedge fund
McBean.
CEO and Army veteran David McCormick.
Okay.
So it's between Oz and McCormick. Oz and McCormick and Oz. And the
Bring
80-1 shot is coming up from behind.
Yeah.
And making ground. And Kathy Barnett is really bad but might win. And so now you have the idea of Doug Mastriano, who's a mastermind of the Stop the Steal thing at Pennsylvania for governor, and then this nutcase for senator.
Cool.
And that's really making Republicans nervous.
All right. Well,
it's hard to call Democrats radical when these are the people.
They will, though. So don't worry about that. If you thrive on listening to them call Democrats radical, you'll still be able to get your fix. They will do it. Look, I hate having to rely on that, but look, it's beyond my control. If it happens, make the most of it and show everybody what it's all about and what Republicans are really looking to do. But boy, I'm going to be nervous until it's all over.
Right. Meanwhile, the January 6th committee is
I don't even live in
finalizing witness
Pennsylvania.
lists and topics. They had a high-stakes hearing in June, and we know now that the first hearing will be June 9th.
Now we know. Now it can be told.
Broad overview of the panel's 10-month investigation set the stage for subsequent hearings, and some people have agreed to talk
June 9th.
in private but refused to talk in public. And so they've interviewed people like the Trump kids. They want to interview Jeff Rosen and Richard Donahue from the Department of Justice about what was going on there. And we'll see what happens.
All right. May 9th is Victory Day, and June 9th is Hearing Day. 6-9, by the way, for all the people who think that's nice.
Yeah.
You can enjoy that, and we'll see. Hope it doesn't get pushed back any.
Right. And then
Don't
finally,
have time
speaking of
for
being
that.
pushed back, Judge Nix's January 6th plea deal after right-wing streamer Baked Alaska declares himself innocent. He goes in
Yeah.
for a plea deal.
Yeah.
And the
Which
judge says,
means
"You understand a plea deal means you're guilty."
Yeah.
And he says, "Wait a minute,
But-
I'm innocent. I'm just doing this because I'm going to get a better deal out of it." And
Yeah.
the judge says, "No. That's not how it works."
Yeah. Meanwhile, Baked Alaska is tweeting the whole thing, saying, "No, that is not how it works." He's judge-splaining everything. These, what did he tweet? It was something like, these MFers really don't know how the court system works, meaning the
Right.
courts,
Yeah,
I guess. But
exactly.
anyway, yeah, you can't do that. You can't have a plea deal where you come in and say, "Oh, I don't agree to the deal." I mean, you can.
Emmett
but-
Sullivan said, "Look, are you pleading guilty because you're guilty?" And he said, "No, I'm pleading guilty because I'm innocent." Go,
Yeah.
No, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
Think about it. Go talk to your lawyer. We'll do this again.
I mean, it's funny because it is kind of how it actually works, but no, you have to go in and tell the story. The court actually is supposed to care that you're not just looking for a deal. And so they did, and I guess this guy just didn't know that they really cared about the truth. So, whoops. I mean, you do have to, go in there and solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. And if then you say, "I'm guilty," but you don't believe it, that's a bad thing. All right. Well, we'll see you on next week, Monday.
Yeah.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Update from Canada, where they too have flattened the curve, but the curve has flattened some of them back. Ricky tells us all the way from PEI that it's even further north than Portland, Maine, by the way. Yeah, quite a ways too. I've driven that route. At any rate, the hospitals, I guess, aren't being overrun by patients, but she says in some cases the hospitals are being overrun in reverse. Underrun, perhaps, is the way we could put it. Maybe they're overrun with staff shortages made worse due to COVID. Just about all of my dialysis nurses have had it. So again, yeah, I'm not even sure what we're talking about at the end there. Have had COVID, or they've just had it with being dialysis nurses and they're out of there, because that's happening in a lot of hospitals too. And sometimes it's because of COVID and the way they get treated when they actually have it. Though I imagine that's not the case perhaps in Canada, where they have the national health care and it's not as big a deal, and you're not going to get fired for taking time off when you're sick with COVID and you work in a dialysis hospital. So hopefully they are, out there taking care of the nurses, and that they've had it means they've had COVID and been successfully nursed by others through it and are back on their feet. But during the time when they're out, they're out. Nothing you can do about that. And, okay. That's a possibility too. And problems can develop for the hospitals from either side. Supply side or demand side, right? We supplied too many sick people, we overrun the hospital. Or is it that there's more people coming in demanding care, whereas the supply of care is another way of ruining things too? Yeah, I think that's probably the better way of explaining it. Okay. Let's see. Which direction can we go next? Oh, yes. I wanted to turn around and maybe take a look at what Rebecca Romans had sent to us, a Molly Jong Fast tweet. Always a good bet. With a New York Times article attached. That just raises the odds, increases the odds that we'll actually read this crazy thing. And she thought it would be a good idea to focus on today. Let's give it a shot. Molly tweeting, American democracy could die right here. Let's find out where and why this thing is. Oh, look at this. The latest trend on the laptop is to open everything twice into 2 tabs somehow. I must be, maybe the double click thingy is overly sensitive. Where in particular could democracy die? And the answer is Georgia. Always in danger, quite honestly, of dying in Georgia. And this story from the New York Times by Barbara McQuaid, titled, The Most Pivotal Elections in 2022 Are Not the Ones You Think. Or, as you know, I always read these things with an extra dose of paranoia. Not the ones you think, because you're so dumb. Now read my article. I do hate that construction of headlines. Why isn't it the ones I think? Let me see. Is it because I think 2022. Because I think a Senate race is the most pivotal one or something like that. Well, guess what? As it happens, it's probably the ones that we've thought about for a long time as being the most pivotal. And Barbara McQuaid just isn't willing to give us the credit for thinking that way. Although, whenever you have it, then you have a fight about something like this and everybody says, but the authors of the articles very rarely have any control over what the headline is going to be. Someone completely different does that. Well, that person is a jerk then. Just that I don't know who it is. But if I find out, I'm writing in chalk outside of their house because that works. What's happening? The ones that you dummy, think are most central, or what did it say? Most pivotal. Well, no, you're wrong. What's most pivotal is illustrated here in the photo that comes with the headline, and the caption tells you Jody Heiss is the person in the photo here, along with Donald Trump. Jody Heiss, a candidate for Georgia Secretary of State with Donald Trump. That's what the caption says. Mr. Heiss has said that, quote, I believe with all my heart, whatever there is of it, the will of Georgia voters was subverted in 2020. And we can already guess what the whole story is because we already thought this, even though the headline says we didn't think this. But yes, running for Secretary of State, as is the case with Jody Heiss, there and in a lot of states, it will be pivotal to determining the outcome of a lot of races if they decide to cheat. Now, why don't you think this? You do think this. Why does Barbara McQuaid or whoever wrote her headline think you don't think this? Because they weren't paying attention that we're coming on 20 years, I would say, of at least the Daily Kos community, which is routinely dismissed as hopelessly naive, radical, etc., whatever, by the right wing and tagged as a hate site and all the various stupid conclusions other people have come to about this. For 20 years, the Daily Kos community has been telling itself and telling anyone who will listen that those races are in fact pivotal. Going back, I would say, to post 2004 election, when it was the talk of the site for a considerable amount of time, sometimes more rationally, sometimes not, but the talk of the site that Ohio in 2004 had seen its vote somehow manipulated, and that the evildoer behind it all was then Ohio Secretary of State, what was it, Mike Steele? Is that where he came from? Do I have the name correct? Is that right? I can't even trust my own memory here. But let me see. Just check my own memory here and say Michael Steele, who later became Republican National Committee chair, and who also, by the way, became, interestingly enough, something of a never-Trumper, as I recall. But when he was the Secretary of State, and then afterwards it became like a pivotal election thing on Daily Kos and the surrounding blogosphere, that the Republican candidate, I guess, if I don't know if he was running for re-election or what, but that was a pivotal race, and things had to be, Democrats had to be mobilized to win that race, and probably in other states this was likely the same. So for 20 years, the dirty effing hippies have been saying, yeah, those Secretary of State races are pivotal. And they've done it with greater and lesser intensity along the way. But it's something we've known for some time. Even this specific race in Georgia, it's been known for some time. And by the way, it's because we've been reading Barbara McQuade's articles and other people publishing similar news in the New York Times and elsewhere. I don't know why they keep saying that we don't know this. You keep reporting it, we keep reading it, people keep paying you. And then you keep insisting that we're too dumb to know this. I hate that kind of headline, but that's not the central part of this piece, I don't think. Barbara, please tell us more about it. Barbara McQuade, by the way, not by trade a New York Times reporter. This is an opinion piece. McQuade is a law professor at University of Michigan. So she almost certainly had nothing to do with the selection of this title. However, you should pick up the phone and complain because it makes you sound condescending when you might not be. On the other hand, you are a law professor. You might be a very condescending person. I don't know, actually. But anyway, the news, or the opinion. The fate of our democracy doesn't hinge on the battle for the House or the fight to control the Senate, but on state elections for a once sleepy office, secretaries of state, which you've known for 20 years. Maybe Barbara actually knows that. Maybe Barbara was the one telling us that we needed to do this in Ohio in 2004 and 2005, for all I know. No elected officials will be more pivotal to protecting democracy or subverting it than secretaries of state. While their responsibilities vary from state to state, most oversee elections, a role in which they wield a tremendous amount of power. Secretaries of state own the bully pulpit on voting, and they control the machinery of elections. They also have a platform to spread disinformation, such as false claims that voting by mail is not secure. A Republican Secretary of State could reduce the number of ballot boxes or polling places in Democratic areas and limit staffing to create long lines that dissuade potential voters. They can also refuse to certify the results in particular counties or even the entire state. In a close presidential race, if even one Secretary of State in a swing state were to put his thumb on the scale, we could see an election that really is stolen. This has happened before. In 2000, Katherine Harris, Florida's Secretary of State, halted the recount process and certified George W. Bush, for whom she served as campaign chairwoman, as the winner of Florida's electoral votes. But our current political moment is even more fraught, as Donald Trump casts doubt on the last election, whipping his supporters into frenzy, while Republican field generals quietly maneuver conservative hardliners into positions of power. Before we even get to this, by the way, do they end up talking about this? I don't know. Well, you know what? We'll read on and see whether it gets mentioned. You can't mention everything. It's not her fault. But that's our job, is to mention everything else. She never gets around to Ohio in 2004. But by the way, we were able to make a story of it in 2004 in Ohio at Daily Kos, in large part because people had seen it before. They had seen Katherine Harris in 2000. And a great reminder here that she does all of this not only as Secretary of State, but having served as George W. Bush's campaign chair for the state. So she's got a vested interest in one of the candidates winning that goes beyond just being a member of that candidate's political party, but to have personally led the campaign in that state. It would be a blow to her prestige and her climb up the ladder if she were not able to deliver Florida for Bush. So, you just manipulate what you have to manipulate in order to make it work. And there are more and less legitimate ways of doing it. And in fact, some of the ones that she listed here are among the more legitimate. I mean, they're wrong and they should be illegitimate, but they are considered to be legitimate because we put them purposefully within the power of the Secretary of State. The decisions about where the ballot boxes or voting machines will go and where staffing will be adequate and where it won't be, and where the old broken machines go, and how many machines per polling place and how many polling places per town or what have you. All within the purview of the Secretary of State, but certainly subject to abuse. Then, of course, there's even more radical approaches to it, which maybe we'll get around to when we read one of the other articles or one of the digests of the newly revealed emails that we discussed yesterday from John Eastman. And we need to go back over those again. I tried my best, but I think we maybe failed to explain just how egregious what he was proposing actually was. All right, back to this article, though, by way of laying the groundwork. And I skimmed over, and I don't see here, now that we're sort of kind of focusing on Georgia because Jody Hice is running for Secretary of State there, we might as well point out that this is a running problem for Georgia. The current governor, Brian Kemp, was elected on a ballot that he oversaw. You all remember the Stacey Abrams story, right? He was elected governor of Georgia on a ballot that he oversaw as the then Secretary of State of Georgia. And Stacey Abrams was sometimes a little cagey about it, sometimes a little more direct about it, but pointing out that in the end, the interpretation of how the vote should be counted, where things begin to get a little less legitimate when you start to say things like, all right, I did everything I could to limit ballot boxes in black areas of the state so that people inclined, or that I think are inclined, to come out and vote for Stacey Abrams just don't do it. But on top of that, you find things like anybody whose envelope on their absentee ballot has a corner bent in. Those things we're just going to decide under the auspices of our office as Secretary of State that those are going to be thrown out. Unless, of course, it's the other corner that's folded because that one happens to be a Republican ballot, right? So, but you can choose to say this is a valid vote, that's not a valid vote. You can't, if you don't stop them in the front line by limiting the number of ballot boxes or drop sites or voting machines in black areas, then once all right, fine, they got through and they cast votes. What can we do to pare down the number of votes that we from those areas that we actually have to count? You can do that too as Secretary of State. And now he's the governor. Poof. Whatever. All right. So back to the article here. 27 states will choose a Secretary of State this fall. And in 17 of those states, at least one of the Republican candidates for the office actively denies that President Biden won the 2020 election. That's like the hottest thing to say if you're running as a Republican for Secretary of State. 14 candidates have formed the America First SOS Coalition, whatever the hell that's supposed to be, which aims to, quote, reverse electoral fraud by eliminating mail-in ballots, requiring single-day voting, and committing to aggressive voter roll cleanup, end quotes. Measures that could suppress thousands of Democratic votes. If they win office, Republicans will control the voting process in these 5 crucial swing states where the 2024 election may be decided. One of them, Georgia, where the Republican incumbent, Brad Raffensperger, is fighting for his political life in the May 24th primary after having refused Mr. Trump's demands to, quote, find the 11,780 votes he needed to overturn Mr. Biden's victory in that state. Although Mr. Raffensperger withstood Mr. Trump's efforts in 2020, he has now joined the crusade, warning against the threat of voter fraud, supporting Georgia's restrictive new voting laws, and citing, quote, voter confidence as the, quote, number one issue American voters face. In other words, the great hero Brad Raffensperger absolutely would not have made the same decision and will not make the same decision in 2024 if he's still Secretary of State that he did in 2020. Remember, I've been saying for a long time, and I'm a kook, so don't listen to me, but I've been saying for a long time that he absolutely wanted to comply with Trump's demands. He just felt that the state of the law would leave him exposed potentially to very serious criminal charges if he went ahead and did this and the whole thing didn't work out in the end. He could be, and even if it did work out for Trump, he'd be sitting on the bubble waiting for a pardon, which might never come. Like, you might think if he really believed that it would work, then he would just make Trump president. And if he was worried about the state of the law such that he would find himself charged criminally, he'd get a pardon from Trump for having done him this favor. But remember, I mean, maybe this is beyond his thinking. I don't know. Maybe he just worried about something else. But it would be very wise. I would be very impressed, quite frankly, if Brad Raffensperger considered that and then said, yeah, but it's Donald Trump. Any other person, well, other people ordinarily wouldn't consider going this far and saying, yeah, I'll promise you a pardon. But if they did do that, they would probably follow through and grant that pardon. Donald Trump would just as soon not do it. I'm not certain what his rationale, if there is one, is for that, but it's very likely that Donald Trump would end up abandoning you and you'd be sentenced to prison and you'd be sitting there saying, well, then I'll tell my story and that'll show him, but you'll be doing it from prison and he won't. So, he might have considered that and said, that's why I'm not going to do it. But now that the state of the law is such, thanks to the Republican-controlled legislature there, that he could get away with finding those votes, he probably would. All right, well, anyway, his main primary opponent goes even further. Representative Jody Hice, a former pastor endorsed by Mr. Trump, is an election denier who has said that I believe with all my heart that the will of Georgia voters was subverted in 2020. Republicans have held this office since 2006, so most likely one of these two men will be in control in 2024. In Michigan, state number 2 here, the Democrats are in a stronger position. The Democratic incumbent Jocelyn Benson will face Christina Caramo, I don't know if she pronounces it that way, but I will, a community college instructor endorsed by Mr. Trump this fall. He doesn't even know what community colleges are, of course, but whatever. Ms. Benson, a former election law professor, literally wrote the book on the role of secretaries of state and the role they play in protecting the democratic process, and resolutely withstood challenges to Michigan's 2020 election. Her opponent, on the other hand, has made debunked claims that she witnessed election fraud while observing poll workers in Detroit in 2020, and said that the Capitol riot was conducted by Antifa posing as Trump supporters. Mr. Trump has been stumping for Ms. Caramo for a reason. This is not just about 2022, he said at a recent rally. This is about making sure Michigan is not rigged and stolen again in 2024. Recent polling shows Ms. Benson with a 14-point lead over Ms. Caramo, but that margin is small considering Ms. Benson's greater name recognition. In Pennsylvania, the Secretary of State is appointed, so the toss-up governor's race will decide who ends up overseeing elections, while the Democratic contender for governor, Josh Shapiro, the state attorney general, has made voting rights a cornerstone of his campaign. Some of the Republican candidates seem determined to undercut them. Recent polling shows State Senator Doug Mastriano, a retired Army colonel, like Gaddafi, with a PhD in history, maybe like Gaddafi, I don't know, leading the rest of the Republican candidates. Mr. Mastriano has embraced Trump's claims of a stolen election. So you just failed history, dude. Anyway, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer, he spoke with the president in the days after the election and pushed for a new slate of electors to be sent to Congress. Videos show him and his wife wandering through the barricades after rioters, some of whom he'd paid to send to Washington, breached the Capitol. His election as governor is a strong possibility in a state that tends to seesaw between Democrats and Republicans, at which point we would declare this Whiskey Rebellion 2 and conquer Pennsylvania. That's my suggestion. Other candidates for Secretary of State include Mark Fincham in Arizona and Jim Marchant in Nevada. Mr. Fincham, a state representative who attended the Stop the Steal rally in Washington last year, has introduced a resolution to decertify the results of the 2020 election in 3 big counties and a bill to empower the Arizona legislature to reject election results, just like Eastman was suggesting everybody do in his memo and emails. As of the end of the first quarter, Mr. Fincham led all other candidates in the race in fundraising, making him the most likely to win the Republican primary and a strong candidate in the general election. Mr. Marchant has followed the same campaign playbook in Nevada. Former state legislator, he has not only called it almost statistically impossible that Joe Biden won the state, but also said he would not have certified Nevada's slate of electors had he been Secretary of State in 2020. Indeed, he pushed for his state to submit an alternative slate. While Nevada has gone to the Democratic candidate in the past 4 presidential elections, 3 of its past 4 secretaries of state have been Republicans, and this race could go either way. For Democrats to fend off the America First slate, they will need to invest in these races, helping candidates build the name recognition they need to combat the onslaught from the right. That'll take time, money, and a strategy to raise awareness about the crucial role of these offices play in protecting our democracy. A nationwide effort like the SOS Project, which was started by a group of Democrats following the 2004 elections. Woo! SOS, by the way, not just Save Our Ship, but Secretary of State. Started after the 2004 elections and folded several years later, could help. If it wasn't that it had folded several years later, but something like it could. Individuals can also help by volunteering for Secretary of State candidates and by talking to their neighbors and on social media about the importance of these positions. Races for other offices may attract bigger names, but elections for Secretary of State may bring about the most significant shifts in power in 2022. As Mr. Trump has said, sometimes the vote counter is more important than the candidate. And that's an important point. Who decides, just as it's important in abortion and the Supreme Court and everything surrounding it, who decides what's going to be a legal vote is just as important as the number of votes that get cast. You can change the outcome by changing what counts as a vote. So let's move on, although the next break is coming, to other views of these things and see if we can't clarify what we've got here. Let me read you which one's shorter. Let's see. I'll take a look quickly and see if I can figure out which one I can cram in and which one I can't. Why don't we try and cram in the Talking Points memo piece by Josh Kovensky about this thing. Eastman the mathematician. MAGA lawyer advised lawmaker to make up formula to throw out Biden votes. This is another way you can do this stuff after the fact if your voter suppression stuff doesn't work well enough. Trump attorney John Eastman had a plan to switch Pennsylvania from Biden to Trump in the final days of 2020, have state legislators count the votes just a little bit differently. In Eastman's case, newly released emails show he wanted to have the legislature use a formula he devised that, in his words, would leave the state with a significant Trump lead. It's a variation on the age-old and apocryphal Stalin quote that, quote, "It's not who votes that counts, but who does the counting." Yes, that's, I guess, if this is not, I guess they're saying it's not really a Stalin quote, but it's attributed to him. And Donald Trump, former president of the United States, campaigning again for the presidency, quoting that very Stalin-like quote. But quoting it approvingly. It's a variation on that, of course. The emails were obtained via a Freedom of Information Act request from the Colorado Ethics Institute. First reported by the Denver Post, the emails stem from Eastman's time as fellow at the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2020. He made the suggestion in an exchange with Pennsylvania State Representative Russ Diamond, who had contacted the conservative law professor on December 4th after seeing Eastman testify before the Georgia State Senate, two of the states that Barbara McQuade just brought up. Diamond wanted to know whether the supposedly unlawful election gave the state legislature the right to exercise its plenary authority to appoint presidential electors, regardless of restraints existing within Pennsylvania's constitution and statutes. And the fact that they had declared that they would use an election to determine this and had already had that election. I would add. Diamond forwarded Eastman a draft resolution that he had written. It would declare that the state's General Assembly had found the election to be unlawful and that therefore the state had failed to make a choice on the day prescribed by law and could not determine which candidate won. Eastman replied the same day with several edits. The main one was to suggest that the legislature be more aggressive. Not only should the state legislature declare the election invalid, Eastman wrote on December 4th, they should choose a new slate of electors for Trump. Do you want to go only halfway and require another resolution to actually choose a slate of electors, or should you do it all in one resolution? I don't know the dynamic of your legislature, so I can't answer that, but my intuition is that it would be better to do what you need to do in one fell swoop. Eastman added that Diamond should add a section to the resolution that included factual findings, and that's in quotes, of course, because they're not factual, and they might even be findings, based in part on hearings held before the Pennsylvania state legislature the week before. Trump himself appeared at the hearing via his attorney's cell phone. You remember that one? Which was held up to the mic for state legislators to hear. The president proceeded to complain that nobody would overturn the election for him. And he used the word overturn. Eastman went on to articulate a series of claims that the legislators could make to do just that. Why not just prorate the vote totals, ignoring a certain subset of mail-in ballots? More information and detail on this after the break. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue on with this TPM piece, which I had mistakenly, and I really knew this wouldn't work, would fit inside the time I had left before the break. Now we'll just carry it over, and that gives us plenty of time to walk into the next couple pieces here. All right, where were we? Yes, right. Eastman goes on to articulate a mathematical solution to this whole thing. If you can't declare the election null and void, why not just declare the numbers to mean something completely different? Why not redefine how the numbers are calculated? If Biden has 10,000 votes and Trump has 8,000, why not say, well, sure, that's true, but that's only if you count all the invalid illegal votes. And now here is a way to get rid of some of these things. Now, if it were simply throw out all the mail-in ballots, that would be dirty politics, but perhaps still within the purview of the Secretary of State. The thing is, they weren't really sure whether or not throwing out all the mail-in ballots and all the absentee ballots would actually end up with a Trump win versus a Biden win. So they couldn't just rely on that. So he has to come up with this formula. And here it's laid out. Eastman went on to articulate a series of claims that the legislators could make to do just that, that is, come up with a different result. Why not just prorate the vote totals, ignoring a certain subset of mail-in ballots? Not all of them, just some of them. For example, depending on how many ballots were counted that were received after the statutory deadline, say 10,000 for example's purpose, those 10,000 votes need to be discarded, and you can take the absentee ballot ratio for each candidate in the counties where late received ballots were illegally counted and deduct the prorated amount from each candidate's total, Eastman wrote. It's not just find out which ones were received afterwards and get rid of those, but do an extrapolation. In other words, basically exactly the kind of mathematics that Republicans usually always complain is invalid in taking the United States Census, where they believe that a certain minority population or certain minority populations that either are traditionally undercounted or have reason to try to want to be undercounted, perhaps, or where their interviewers have been unable to reach people where there's questions, they rely on mathematical formulas to try and extrapolate the more likely actual population of the area. And Republicans say, no, that can't work. The mathematical thing is just garbage. You either contact the people or you don't. That's the only methods you can use for counting people in the census, the end. You can't just make these assumptions. However, when it comes to something that actually affects like day-to-day, I mean, the census affects day-to-day life, but in a far more abstract way. It has to go through 16 layers of policymaking first, but it does have a big impact. But in actually choosing the president of the United States or whatever else, the various other things that were on the ballot at the time, that's much more direct. And if you can't extrapolate on the census, then logically speaking, you can't extrapolate on the elections either, but to hell with logic. They're gimmitarians. Here you can, there you can't. That's all there is to it. I want it here and I don't want it there. But listen to how crazy it gets. Okay, so for example, like he says, if there's 10,000 votes after the statutory deadline, you can get rid of those, but then I don't even understand exactly where he's going here. You take the absentee ballot ratio for each candidate in the counties where late received ballots were illegally counted, another issue there, and deduct the prorated amount from each candidate's total. And to be honest, I bet he didn't even know whether that really was going to come out in Trump's favor or not, but he might have had a good guess. He might have turned out to be right, but he probably didn't actually know. But by the way, yes, one of their chief complaints, of course, is that during the COVID pandemic, when it was very difficult not only to get your ballots into people's hands and then back into the hands of the authorities to count them because everyone was isolating, and the mail system was running kind of funky, and through no fault of your own, or perhaps through the intentional planning of Louis DeJoy and Donald Trump, you could mail an absentee ballot with what would ordinarily, under normal circumstances, have been plenty of time left before the statutory deadline and still find it delayed and therefore not counted if the statutory deadline was enforced the same way. However, there were lots of last-minute appeals to local judges who said, yeah, as long as it's received by X number of days after the election and is otherwise unopened and untampered with, yes, in the interest of letting everybody get their votes counted in the middle of a pandemic, we find it constitutional, legal, and on solid ground to say, yeah, the local boards of elections in these counties can extend that deadline. Eastman said from a maximalist position, no, the date is the date, and that's all there is to it, pandemic or no pandemic. And further, that local boards of elections had no authority to extend the deadline, and it had to be the state legislature that would extend the deadline, even though in many of these states it was often the case that the state legislature had delegated that responsibility to the local elections boards. But we want to undo it retroactively because something Constitution. That was the big theory, that not only can they take back their permission to local elections boards to change the date if necessary, but they also can take back the whole election if they don't like the results and just choose a different answer. Eastman is still sort of using half measures here, saying you can keep the election, keep the veneer of elections. You should just change the vote total. Later on, when that doesn't work, he also advocates for saying, all right, you can also just rescind the whole election because you have that plenary power as the state legislature, which almost no one but people on his side believe to be true, and probably won't believe to be true. If it were ever exercised by a Democrat, they would say, no, that's totally invalid. There's no support for that in the Constitution whatsoever. But at the moment, they need it, so they say it's true. Let's see. There's further detail in here and in the other tweet thread I wanted to share with you. In an emailed statement to TPM Wednesday, Diamond put distance between himself and Eastman's ideas, writing, "At no time did I consider presuming any alternative count of the popular vote in Pennsylvania." In the December 4th exchange, Eastman floated another option that had to do with verification. Why not just apply the, quote, historical rejection rate for ballots and then discount each candidate's totals by a prorated amount based on the absentee percentage those candidates otherwise received? I don't know if it's further explained in here, but I think that the tweet thread I have later explains it a little more clearly. So maybe we'll leave that for there. But if you're catching the idea here, this is an even dumber extrapolation that he attempts to impose. That, Eastman pointed out, would leave Trump with a lead in the state, therefore bolstering the argument for the legislature adopting a slate of Trump electors, perfectly within your authority to do anyway, but now bolstered by the untainted popular vote, except that it's been tainted. He just tainted it. That would help provide some cover, he added, and people are focusing on that. Cover? What would you need cover for if you were doing the right thing? Diamond replied to Eastman the same day, thanking him for the ideas while complaining about the Trump team. Honestly, the Trump legal team was not exactly stellar at Pennsylvania's hearing, failed to provide the affidavits for their witnesses, and made a glaring error by purporting that more ballots had been returned than mailed out, he wrote. It is for this reason that I so latched onto your comments that actual fraud is irrelevant when the election itself is unlawful. Aha. I get it. Diamond tried to separate his efforts in 2020 from those of Eastman in the statements to TPM. Professor Eastman was but one of many individuals I interacted with in the aftermath of the 2020 election. I believe the emails in question pretty much comprised the sum of our interactions. Diamond added that he continues to believe that jealously guarding and preserving the legitimate authority of the Pennsylvania General Assembly should always remain a priority. Basically, Diamond's position here is, okay, you have been unable, the whole Trump team has been unable to prove the fraud that they allege. At least they still have this other theory which says that if there's if the election itself is unlawfully held, or the election is unlawful, then we can determine who the slate of electors are going to be. I mean, that stands on better grounds, except, how do you get to the point where everyone will agree? No one will ever always agree, but how do we get the people who count, the judges, if we're still counting on them as legitimate people, to declare the election illegal? And again, the theory was, well, the Constitution says that the state legislatures get to choose how the state electors will be chosen. And two parallel theories running there. One is that what that means somehow, they interpret that to mean, what that means isn't, as we've explained before, that the legislature gets to choose the method of selecting the electors, and every state currently, and for many years since whenever, have always said that method, when it comes to selecting electors for the President of the United States, will be popular election within this state. I don't know when the last time was, or if there even was a time, I'm sure there must have been at some point in the early days, when the state legislature simply said, well, we will select the electors directly. There will be no election in this state for President of the United States. I don't know if any other methodology has ever been used. There are, you can pick anyone you want, I guess, so long as the legislature approves it. I think it's probably been limited to popular election. And if there's ever been anything else done, direct election by the state legislature, the way they used to directly select the Senate before the 18th Amendment, which would amendment 17th Amendment, I can't remember which one it was, for direct election of senators by the people. You remember? Okay. Anyway, the point is that there, as I said, two parallel theories. One which says that if the legislature chooses to have an election, but then the election somehow is invalid or illegal, then the only alternative we'll have in order for our people to be represented at the Electoral College is to select the slate itself. So how can we get to declaring the election illegal? And the theory was that clause, which gave the legislatures the opportunity to choose the method by which the electors will be selected, actually means something completely different. In their view, it actually means that the only body that can set the date for the election, although I guess they don't have much choice in the general election, But the only body that can make any of the rules surrounding the election, the times that the polls will be open, the number of polling places that there will be, whether or not they'll use voting machines of this kind or that kind, paper or no paper, receipts or no receipts, ballot boxes, whether there will be drop boxes, whether absentee voting will be allowed and under what circumstances, what will happen to people who stand in line before the polls close, but the polls close while they're waiting in line. All of those decisions, can you give them water, etc., have to be made directly by the state legislature and no one else, that they are undelegable to any other body. And if those jobs are delegated to another body, that doesn't just negate the rule, it potentially renders the whole election tainted and illegal and unconstitutional, and throws the whole thing to the state legislature. We said there has to be an election and it should be done this way, et cetera, and a local government, a local board of elections said, well, if you get online before closing time at 8 p.m., you're eligible to vote. We say, we didn't say anything about that at all. They might even not have addressed it. I guess if the legislature specifically said, no, the last vote counted is the one that's dropped in the box at 7:59. At 8 o'clock, doesn't matter whether you've been in line for 3 hours or not, you're out. If they said that, that would probably stand. But they rarely do say that. Instead, they leave it up to the local elections boards in many cases, not necessarily, closing time. When that tends to be statewide, they want to kind of harmonize those laws, but others about where the polling places will be and how many machines will go there. That's minutia that they leave up to the local boards of election because they don't want to have anything to do with it. Now the theory, though, becomes, well, because we didn't set all those rules, that renders the whole thing illegal. I mean, that's a very convenient outcome, right? Oh, no, we lost the election. I want the electors to be Trump electors. How can we do it? Well, what about this? Right here, it says that one local board of election allowed somebody to walk their dog and drop their ballot in the ballot box. And we didn't say dogs were allowed at polling places, and a drop box is going to be considered a polling place. So the whole election is illegal and we select Trump. That's the essence of what they're trying to do here. So now, of course, Diamond is trying to distance himself from it. But so that was theory one. Theory two was, well, skip the whole thing and just say, no matter what happens, even if the election isn't illegal in any way and we got nothing, it's still my interpretation of the Constitution, I think Eastman believes this, that the legislature can still say, we made our decision, we stood by it, but we lost, so let's undo our decision and simply say, no, it says we can always have that choice. The Constitution says it's up to us to select the method, and that includes declaring that we had our fingers crossed when we chose the method the first time, and now we get to select a different method, a second bite at the apple. There's nothing more un-American, I think, than this idea that we'll hold an election, listen to the people, but if the people don't say what we want, we'll just do it all over again. But we won't do the election over again. We'll simply select who we want. You have the right to have an election and to have your voice heard unless we don't like your voice, right? That's just never going to fly. But Eastman's whole theory depends ultimately on that actually being what the founders intended in the Constitution. And there's no way in hell they intended that. That's insane. Not even King George III himself, the ultimate tyrant, would have believed that that was a wise, rational way to go. The vote is, if you don't like votes, you don't like votes. Don't hold them. But if you hold them, you can't just say, it's almost 100% better to say, well, the vote was held improperly and so therefore illegal, and that's why we're doing it. That's much better cover. But Eastman says you don't even need that cover. You just say, we changed our minds. So, that's pretty incredible. There's another thread that goes into further detail about this that I thought I would share with you in the time we have together that I think helps explain some of the mathematical craziness Eastman was trying to do. Angus Johnston is the author of this thread, a historian, in other words, a PhD in history, like Doug Mastriano, a historian and an advocate for American student activism. How do you like that? Historian of and advocate for American student activism at the City University of New York, CUNY, as they like to call it. Eastman, he says, isn't just talking about throwing out votes here. He's holding up Kyle Cheney's tweet about his Politico piece about Eastman's newly discovered memos and emails. Eastman isn't just talking about throwing out votes here. He's talking about estimating the ratio of Biden to Trump votes in categories he doesn't like, then reducing each candidate's tally according to that mathematical estimate. Do you remember we were just reading it here in the TPM piece? The most extreme version of what got expressed or what was reprinted here in the TPM one was, where was it here? Right. Why not just apply the historical rejection rate for ballots and then discount each candidate's totals by a prorated amount based on the absentee percentage that those candidates otherwise received? I believe Angus Johnston's thread here gets to that in the next couple of tweets. But if not, I'll come back to it. In other words, Angus says, he's proposing to abandon the idea that a vote tally in a presidential election corresponds to any tally of actual votes actually cast. He only said actually once there. In other words, I'm reading it again. In other words, he's proposing to abandon the idea that a vote tally in a presidential election corresponds to any tally of votes actually cast. It's just going to be an algorithm, and I'm going to make it up. It really is kind of incredible to just see it in print. And he's quoting someone else's tweet here, which has the right screen grab in it. Per the exchange, Eastman suggested that GOP legislators could simply cite their concerns with Pennsylvania's absentee ballot procedures and then use historical data to discount each candidate's totals by a prorated amount based on the absentee percentage those candidates otherwise received. It's still a little unclear, but I'm pretty sure he gets into it somewhere down the line. But as I scan, I don't see it. So maybe it was someone else that went with some, may or may not have it in pocket. But in case I don't, this whole prorated thing, in other words, they're saying this. As it turns out, the rejection rate of absentee ballots was much lower in Pennsylvania's elections in 2020 than it had been in previous elections. Now, there's many factors that go into that, but the suspicion was, and in some cases this is probably true, was that the standards had been loosened somewhat, largely because of the pandemic and because many people who typically had never voted by absentee or whatever other mail-in method you want to talk about, or drop box method, never voted that way before, were likely to have some additional difficulty because they were first-time voters or whatever the stresses of the pandemic were likely to cause things that could technically, and in years past might have caused local elections judges or local boards of election to reject a ballot, but that this time around they were a little bit more forgiving. And Eastman's theory is this is entirely inappropriate and illegal because, in his view, the state legislature didn't say you could do that. And that's an erroneous interpretation. But on top of that, he might also argue, well, why the more lenient standards? Even if you don't believe the state legislature has to act in order to make this permissible, why change your standards at all? You should have to show cause why that's permissible. And if you don't, then something, and it's all illegal. But what ends up happening is he's arguing, all right, so this time around they only rejected 1% of ballots. And usually they reject 5% of ballots. And he suggests that whole thing, right? Why not just use the historical data to discount each candidate's totals by a prorated amount? He's saying, why don't we just say, oh, the historical trends are probably more likely what is true. And the more forgiving standards that allowed only 1% of ballots to be rejected are probably wrong. Why don't we reject 5% of ballots instead? And because it was his guess that many more of the ballots cast by mail were pro-Biden than pro-Trump, 5% across the board of rejection rate would probably net more rejected Biden votes than rejected Trump votes. But I mean, on what basis do you do that? It's just, because they also might very well have just gotten better compliance with the ballot rules among people, and they just did much better because there was a lot of consciousness or awareness raising going on, especially in Pennsylvania, trying to teach people how to properly cast their ballots so that they didn't fall subject to this rejection rate. We don't actually know for sure why the rejection rate was as low as it was. We have some guesses about it, and some of them are probably substantive, but it doesn't matter. Eastman says doesn't matter that people were more educated about how to cast their ballots, and it doesn't matter that they decided under their own authority that was granted to them by the state legislature in some cases, the ability to lower the standards or change the standards or whatever. Doesn't matter, and we don't know. But you can't just go around guessing, well, people meant to screw up their ballots but didn't, so let's throw them out. So Angus Johnston's thread continues. It is kind of incredible, he says, just to see this in print. Eastman is a former law school dean and Supreme Court clerk, by the way. Some of you may remember that in 2000 there were a bunch of weird votes for Pat Buchanan in Florida, specifically in one county, Palm Beach, where the ballot was designed in a weird and confusing way. You remember the butterfly ballot? In 2000, Pat Buchanan, a rabid right-winger with a record of crypto-Nazi views, got a super weird spike in support in Palm Beach County, a heavily Democratic, heavily Jewish jurisdiction. And there really are, by this point, since this was back in 2000, plenty of full-grown adults who are very politically aware who don't actually have a personal memory of this happening, so it's worth recounting. But for the rest of us, it's like a bad memory coming back up. This spike of votes for Pat Buchanan corresponded with and was to a statistical certainty caused by a ballot design flaw that could lead people who thought they were voting for Al Gore to vote for Pat Buchanan instead. This ballot design error cost Al Gore the presidency. It did. It just flat did. Now, Bush was certified the winner in Florida by 537 votes. And a reminder from our earlier story, certified by the Secretary of State of Florida. 537 votes in all of Florida. Certified by the Secretary of State. Who was the Secretary of State? His campaign chairman. Just keep that in mind. It is estimated that Buchanan was credited with 2,000 intended for Gore votes in Palm Beach County. 80% of the election day votes that he received there. 80% of his Palm Beach County votes for Pat Buchanan turned out to be statistically very likely, very probably, almost to a statistical certainty, 2,000 of those belonged to Al Gore. Had they said, well, obviously the intent was, and we should prorate and move those 2,000 votes from Pat Buchanan to Al Gore, that overcomes the 537 vote deficit. Al Gore wins Florida. Al Gore wins the presidency. We know that Buchanan was not the intended recipient of the vast majority of his Palm Beach County votes. We are as sure of it as we can be. We could have brought people in and asked them after the fact, is this your ballot? Who did you vote for? If we were able to match them up, as they're trying to do now with the Trump votes. If we were able to figure it out, they would have said, oh yeah, I absolutely intended to vote for Al Gore, not Pat Buchanan. But it doesn't matter. They didn't even try to do that because that's crazy. The votes were cast, the votes were counted, and the election went to Bush. People still argue about the decision to stop counting ballots, about intimidation of elections officials, about the bizarre reasoning in Bush v. Gore, but nobody argues that those Buchanan votes should have just been given to Gore. Well, I mean, sometimes we wish that, but nobody actually stands up and argues that, and that's a good point, because we all understand that you can't say, well, I estimate that X percent of these votes were improperly granted to candidate Y, so I'm going to change Z votes in the final tally to compensate. Because if you do that, your election is no longer an election, and you no longer live in a democracy. And in the Florida 2000 case, the evidence that Buchanan got those votes in error was overwhelming. No such evidence exists in the case of the 2020 election. So yes, it's a power grab. Yes, it's an attempt to overturn an election by invalidating legally cast votes. But it's also an assault on the whole idea of voting, on the principle that one person casts one vote and you determine the winner of the election by counting them up. Eastman's memo says, don't count them, discount them, the actual opposite of counting them. Don't bother counting how many people voted for Trump and how many people voted for Biden. Start with the outcome you want, reverse engineer it, say Trump won. That's legal because my stupid theory about the plenary power of the legislatures, which is completely wrong and no one has ever espoused, and there's no way in hell that the founders thought that that would be how things would come out, despite the fact that they had designed the upper house of the legislature to be selected in exactly that way. But that also means that they know exactly how to engineer national, federal level elections so that they are determined by state legislatures, and they did not do that with the presidential election. Anyway, I thought the TPM story and Angus Johnston's thread help shine a light on just how crazy Eastman's theory really is.
NetworksRadio.com.
I hope you got it too.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, if you didn't, or you're just sick of it, then stay tuned for Justice Putnam, who will bring you the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next. I don't know that this is necessarily on the menu, but we know that there's always a valuable and delicious selection from around the country and around the world available to you next for the next hour. So do stay tuned. We'll see you on Friday to give you, I don't know, more garbage.